Hi, everyone in business law. I'm Jim Corman, and you've probably seen my introductory video already, so you already know that. But I thought I'd put up a brief review, if you will, of the chapter material as we go forward, because we're missing that dialogue in the traditional brick and mortar class. It might be nice to see me, not just others, because I will put on other presentations of what I think are outstanding um, outlines of the information that's critical from YouTube and other academic sources to help explain the concepts in the chapter. But hey, why not hear it from me too, right? The first chapter, I think, is pretty simple. There's some test material on it. It's stuff you should know for basic civics. It doesn't really go to the heart and soul of business law, but it's a foundation that you have to understand because our business law disputes have to go through certain forums and processes in order to get redress. And if you don't know these fundamentals, it's kind of meaningless if you know the other theories. So it starts off, what is law? Introduction to law. I don't know what the book's definition is as much as my own. I won't test you on it specifically. I test specifically from the book. So those are curious, and you're looking at this video, geez, I wonder how he tests. I wonder what he does. I don't try to hide anything. It's usually derived right from the language within a textbook. But law is usually considered to be a standard by which the government's willing to enforce by sanction or reward, meaning that if you don't abide by that rule or that standard, you're going to be punished. But if the government's not willing to do that, then it's only aspirational, it's only a goal. It has to be created and implemented in such a way that the government's willing to enforce it. Occasionally, every so often I get emails from some of my friends who aren't attorneys and will say these weird things like it's illegal in some town to ride your horse on a Saturday or something, and they think, oh my God, look at these crazy laws that are still in the books. Well, just because they're on the books doesn't make them really laws. To me, it not only has to be in the books, it also has to be something which the government is willing to enforce via a sanction. There's no sanction involved or punishment involved in some way or monetary risk, then it's not really a law. It's maybe an ethical standard or a moral standard or an aspiration of the government, but it's not a law. And a lot of people get confused about that. And I have friends of mine all the time say, hey, I think about my daughter. We're talking about how she used to be embarrassed to be with me when she was younger. She's 24 now and married. But when she was a teenager, I would drop her off at dances and things like that. And I used to have these really bright, I think they were yellow Crocs when Crocs were first coming out, and my orange hunting cap. And she was horrified. And she used to make me drop her off like a couple blocks before her destination so she wouldn't be embarrassed by me. And one day she said, Dad, when she was getting a permit, when she was getting a little older, she's 16, she wanted to get a license. And she goes, Dad, I found out that driving with Crocs is illegal. And I said, really? What law is that? And I said, I'll tell you what, you don't have to contribute towards the cost of your driver education. I'll pay 100% of it. You can find me the law that says that. And then she produces the driver education teacher, who I knew a little bit actually. Says, yeah, Jim, it's against the law to drive Crocs. And I said, well, just can you give me a copy of it? Is it a statute? Is it a regulation? Where's it law? And no one could ever produce it. They produce something that says that you can't drive while impaired or impeded by clothing or things like that. Well, that doesn't mean necessarily that Crocs per se are banned. So sometimes people tell you have to do this, you can't do that. I always question it. Not because I'm a rebel, I just don't think it's always necessarily true, and we sometimes get caught up into this belief system that something's a law when in fact it's not. So what are the main four areas of law, really five, that you should know? Well, there's a hierarchy of them. Let's start at the tallest one that you can't violate, and if you do, by another standard, that standard is considered void because it's unconstitutional. So I gave it away. The Constitution is the highest law of the land, but what makes our system very complex is we have two systems of law, federal and state. So the federal Constitution is the highest form of law in the federal jurisdiction. If it doesn't deal with the question, then maybe the state constitution is the highest authority on that area. But if they're in conflict, if the federal government does have jurisdiction over that area and there's a conflict between the state constitution and the federal, from basic civics, the federal constitution is supreme. There's something called the supremacy clause right in it, that all laws in contradiction or in conflict with the federal law must subside or be considered void. So the highest area of law, Constitution. What is a Constitution? Well, it does two things. Our constitutions, both on the federal and state level, set up our form of government. The legislature, the executive, the judiciary, and it talks about their role and their powers and their spheres of influence, if you will. It creates government. But the Constitution also does some other important things, and usually that's like kind of the second tier if you're taking history of the Constitution when you learn this. It's to put limits on government authority. It's to make sure that certain civil liberties are always protected. In fact, the government has a duty, with it's a civil right, to help protect that from attack or risk by other elements of society, including the government itself. So the Constitution, the highest law of the land. The next one that you deal with a little bit more in business law, you're not going to deal with a ton of constitutional questions in business law, but some could come up. Statutes. Statutes are created by our legislatures on the federal level and the state level, and they impact business significantly. And you know there will checks and balances. It goes through the legislature. Most legislatures are bicameral. There's an upper house, a lower house, Senate, House of Representatives. They have to propose a law. The president has to sign off on it. And if they don't, the law will not come into effect. And we know the legislature has the power to override basically a veto of the governor on the state level or the veto of a president on the federal level by usually a supermajority. It's usually 2/3 of both the House and the Senate. But that is, when I think of law, I always think of statutes, and I shouldn't because it's not the biggest body of law. So we have constitutions, then below that, statutes. Statutes can't violate constitutions or they're null and void. But the third area of law is the biggest. It's called administrative law or regulatory law. That's the biggest area of law. Some of you had to sign up through FAFSA for financial aid. All of those rules are laws, but they're regulatory in nature. They're created by administrative bodies that have the power to implement regulations because the government's realized things need rules. In the federal legislature and the state legislature, they don't have the expertise and the time to get into the minutia of all these different areas, and so they set up administrative bodies to create rules. They have the full force and power of effective law, but they're subservient to statutes and clearly subservient to constitutions. But they're the biggest one. And I'm probably dating myself in terms of age, but there was a comedian when I was a kid called Rodney Dangerfield, and his catchline was, "I get no respect, I get no respect." That to me is what regulations are. They don't get a lot of respect, but they permeate everything we do. And you think about driver's license. One of my kids is about to get her driver's license. She's got a permit. Another one of my son's about to do his too. And there's all kinds of questions about Cinderella license. I guess they can't drive beyond a certain hour while they're a junior operator. There's issues of how much, well, they shouldn't consume any alcohol while they're driving, but if they get caught with any alcohol in their system and they're under the age of 21, there's automatic suspensions. Those are not necessarily statutory. They're probably regulatory in nature. The whole registry of motor vehicles has a ton of regulations. They are laws, but they're not statutes. But does the registry of motor vehicle have to abide by statutory authority that dictates what the registry can and cannot do? Yeah, it gives them a branch of authority and they can't exceed it. The fourth one's the one that confuses a lot of students. It's called the common law. The common law, the book defines it, and it's not inaccurate, but for practical purposes, we don't really think of it this way. The common law is all those legal traditions we brought over from those influential countries that helped basically give birth to our Western thought. So most of it's English, but some of it's Spanish and French as well. But it's mostly English. By the time we had a revolution, we were really a British set of colonies in terms of the common law adaptation and acceptance. What I want you to think of the common law as for this class is case law. Case law that's come down from the appellate court. Some legal controversy gets tried in a trial court. Someone says you're applying the law the wrong way, or the interpretation by the court of what the law should mean is incorrect. They go to the appellate court, and the appellate court will say, this is what the law means in this area. That sets a precedent. That precedent will be followed in cases like that in the future. But it's got to come from the appellate court or higher. Trial courts don't create really too much precedential value. It's like the Supreme Court when it makes a decision about whether the right to abortion shall be allowed for women in the first trimester. That creates a precedent that we know lower courts will follow and legislatures will usually try to follow because they recognize that's the standard that the court has interpreted to be applicable. And we look to them all the time. I get a case about somebody, whether or not the police had a right to search someone's briefcase that was in a trunk without a warrant. It's not spelled out in any statute or any constitutional section. It's something that's probably been determined by case law or the common law. Because once a precedent's established, and it's in your book and it's test material, once a precedent's established, we know that we like to follow in the future. And the Latin term for that, it's in your book on page What's your book? Yeah, it's on page 5, and it's called Stare Decisis. And many of you will ask me how to spell. I'm the worst speller in the world, so you just have to look in chapter 1 on page 5. You'll see the term stare decisis. And what that stands for is let the matter stand. We want predictability in law. We want to know that Jane or John are going to be treated the same as Sue and Tom down the road when they have a very similar case coming before a court of law. It should be the same expectation. I don't really like the fact that the book jumps into this thing about equity versus legal or law courts. Most courts are law courts. They apply a standard, and it's usually a monetary recovery. But some courts have something called equitable powers. You should just know the term equitable. It means something other than a monetary reward. So if I sue you, usually it's for damages. You owe me money, or you should compensate me in some way for a loss. That's a legal standard. An equitable standard is I'm not looking for money. I want you to return that painting to me, or I want you to give that lumber back to me from the lumber yard that I used to own, and then you took the land, but you shouldn't have gotten the lumber. I'm not looking for money. I'm looking for things to be returned to me. That's called a type of injunction. Now, those are equitable remedies. Family law is significantly equitable because it's about who gets to have custody of children, who is required to move away, things like that. Those are things where you're not seeking directly money, but you're seeking behavioral changes, and that's called an equitable remedy. It's what justice requires other than money. You should know the definition. Obviously, the tests are open book, open notes. Then the book switches gears and talks about civil versus criminal law. You should know this as a basic civics concept. And if you're wondering what I'm doing over here, my dog is by my side, so I have to constantly pet her while I talk into the video. Most of you have a kind of a common sense understanding of the difference, but there's some critical ones. Not all civil cases have a jury trial. People are surprised by that. People say, oh, we always have a right to a jury. I'm an American. We live in America. We always have a right to a jury trial. Now, if you look at the Constitution says that you have a right to a jury trial when you're charged with a crime, and you have a right to a jury trial in civil cases if it was recognized in history, at common law, in history, in the case is worth more than $20. So in most cases, do you have a right to a jury trial? In civil cases, yes. Do you always have a right to a jury trial in criminal cases? Yes. If you're the defendant, you get to decide. In civil cases, it's the defendant and the plaintiff that get to decide whether or not they want a jury trial or a trial just in front of a judge. It's a big distinction. The other is the level of proof. And what are civil? I mean, we know what criminal law is. What are criminal law? Those are the types of behaviors that society determines detrimental to society as a whole. Criminal law. That's why people get surprised and say, oh, my girlfriend wants the case dismissed against me. I allegedly pushed her, and I got charged with assault and battery. She wants it dismissed, so go take care of it, Jim. I say, well, wait a minute. It's not your girlfriend versus you. It's the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus you. Because the thing that you allegedly did with your girlfriend is deemed to have damaged society as a whole. That's what criminal behavior is. Even though there may not be a direct victim, like I'm doing illegal drugs, how does that hurt anybody? There's no real direct victim. Doesn't matter. Society thinks that it will be injured by the nature of that behavior, so it's the government that's taking action against the individual for that kind of wrong because it's deemed to be a societal harm. So that's one of the big differences. Criminal law, societal harms. Civil law is private wrongs. You and I were in a contract. It doesn't hurt society what happened between you and I, but I might feel injured or wronged, or you might feel injured and wronged. So it's private wrongs and duties that we're suing over in the civil realm. Another big difference between civil and criminal is the level of proof that's needed. In a civil case, all the plaintiff, the one that's bringing the lawsuit, has to prove is by what we call a preponderance of the evidence, that it's more probable than not that the elements that they're trying to prove are established. That's all they have to do, by a preponderance, just tipping the scale in their favor. It's a very low threshold of proof in civil cases. Criminal cases, you already know because many of you probably watch movies and TVs, and even I do, and even though I don't watch movies that much, or I watch movies but I don't watch TV too much, there's always that thing of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Many of us kind of have a common sense understanding what it is, but it is kind of hard to define. It's a very, very high degree of proof because as a government potentially taking away our money or our liberty, and we expect in a free society that if the government's going to try to do that, they better have significant proof. The best definition, I'll give you Massachusetts definition. You don't need to know this for the test. I test on very rudimentary things, but I tend to lecture forever, and I apologize. These videos are long. I know if I see a video more than 10 minutes, I can't stand it. Hey, take it for what it's worth. Skip through it if you want. But proof beyond a reasonable doubt is defined in Massachusetts as that degree of proof that leaves you with an abiding moral certainty that the defendant did the acts as alleged. Sounds nice, but it's not really that easy to digest and understand. That's what the judge tells the jury. There's a definition from Black Law's dictionary that I memorized, and it's that degree of proof that leaves you without hesitation to draw a conclusion. You're pretty darn confident that the person did the acts. The reality is, when I get in front of a jury, I just think they apply their common sense and they think, did they do it or did they do it, whether it's civil or criminal. I think these legal, intellectual distinctions don't necessarily get understood by a jury very clearly, never mind everyday citizens. I think we all use our gut and make judgments on these things. So distinctions between criminal and civil: government goes in criminal. Civil's mostly private individuals or private companies or organizations over private wrongs. The degree of proof is different between the two. Whether or not you have a right to a jury trial is different between the two. And there are certain rights that are afforded criminal defendants, criminal charge, they're not necessarily guilty yet, that you wouldn't have in a civil. Like, you don't always have a right to an attorney. If I get sued by somebody because they say I breached a contract and they're out money because I didn't follow through on the terms, I don't have a right to have an attorney. I have a right to hire an attorney, but I can't say, government, I'm poor, so please appoint one. But you do in the criminal world, because we think the stakes are so much higher when the government's getting involved trying to take away, again, like liberty or money. We really want people protected. And most people get upset. I know some of you in the group right now say, geez, Corman, I think you seem like a nice guy. Why are you representing these criminals? I'm not representing criminals. I'm representing the process, because in order to have a free society, we really, really don't want government to just be able to do it willy-nilly. They better be able to prove it. And then if they prove it, fine, do the appropriate punishments. But we don't expect in the civil realm to government to get too involved, other than doing what? We want law to provide for civil, meaning appropriate remedies without taking out baseball bats and fisticuffs and beating each other up to see who wins. We want to be able to provide a civil forum, a court of law or a court of equity, to resolve the disputes between people that are recognized in law. And this is mostly going to be contract law here in business class. Some of the other things between civil and criminal. Oh, what's the difference between a felony and a misdemeanor? Those of you that are interested in it, all I'm going to test is obviously felonies are more serious. Misdemeanors are considered less significant. If you really want to know the definition, maybe you got a couple of CJ majors in here they really want to know, but maybe you're an employer someday, or maybe you're going to be an employee. It's usually a big difference if you have a conviction or somebody has a conviction for a felony versus a misdemeanor. The way it's defined in Massachusetts is if you received or was found guilty of a crime that could potentially be punished to state prison by 1 year or more, that's deemed a felony. What's a misdemeanor? Any other crime that you basically can't get a state sentence in. You can only be sentenced to the House of Correction for up to 2.5 years. So misdemeanor and felony, those are the distinctions. Usually it relates to sentencing. Sometimes the statute doesn't make clear. Someone says, I got charged with this. Is it a felony or is it a misdemeanor? You go to the potential penalty, and that determines whether something's a misdemeanor or something's a felony. Ethics. Boy, people really get upset with me when I talk about ethics. I think some of you that are business majors will have to take business ethics. Most business laws are an embodiment of business ethics, but not all business ethics are laws. What do I mean by that? What if I have the ability to really drive a hard bargain and take advantage of my opponent because they're not as sophisticated as I am, or they're not as cunning and cutthroat, and I know you're desperate for money because of maybe you're about to lose your home or something like that, and I really know that if I buy your car or your property at dirt cheap prices, you'll pay for it and I'll take advantage of you. Is that illegal? Probably not. But is it unethical and immoral? I think so, just as a human being. But the law doesn't embody every type of moral and ethical standard because, well, let's face it, we have different varying degrees of ethics and morals in our society. I think teaching of ethics is very, very important. I think being a moral person is critically important. But the reality is if the law doesn't back it up, if you don't have the ability to sue or seek government assistance to protect you because of a legal standard being in play, there's, I hate to say it, ethics are only going to make you feel better that you knew you were on the right side of goodness, for lack of a better way of saying it. Not all ethical standards are the same, and not all ethical standards are embodied in the law. And not to get too deep into history and political science and all that stuff, my passion, because you can see the buttons behind me. Are all laws ethical? Well, not all the time. We've had some laws that were very unethical in this country. We've changed them, fortunately. I think we're at a better stage maybe now than we ever have been. But were there laws in this country that enslaved people? Are there laws in this country that purposely discriminate against people because of their skin color, because of their sexuality, or just their sex? Yeah, we did. We have many. Those were laws. And so to say all laws are ethical would be incorrect. But to say that many of our legal standards that we do decide to adopt as a society are designed to make sure we have fair play and decency, yeah, for the most part it's true. But business ethics aren't always embodied in law. So I've had people come and go, so you know what this person did to me? And I hear about it. I'm like, oh, I know it's terrible. It was awful. But is it the violation of the law? Is it in the Constitution? Is it in a statute? Is it in a rule of regulation? Or is it in the common law? And if it's not, we really can't seek redress other than moving forward and maybe get the legislature to pass a new law. The one thing I didn't mention, I call them baby statutes. Local ordinances can be very powerful. Those of you that are dealing with business, there's zoning laws, there's business licensing laws that can really, really be significant. I don't want to say hamper, but challenge that you're going to have to abide by in order to do business. And so think about local ordinance as well. I know I did as an attorney. I was thinking about buying this Victorian with some friends. We were going to do our law office, and it was zoned residential. And luckily, we looked into it. We would not be able to have a practicing law office in that zone, and we would probably have to rent out the home for somebody for residential living, and we would not have been satisfied with the purchase of a local ordinance. So those are important too. Chapter 1 is pretty straightforward. I'm sorry I took 22 minutes to get through it. I tend to talk long. Don't worry, I can't see you, so you guys can be drinking coffee, having a good old time, just sitting back, relaxing, but hopefully you'll pick up some salient information as we move forward. I think chapter 1 is very easy to digest. Chapter 2 on jurisdiction is a lot more technical, and hopefully I'll have that up in the next couple of days. Otherwise, be well, and don't be afraid to reach out with questions or concerns. Thanks.